Quickly before I get into the video, if you're a nerd like me and want to quickly join, I've set up a Discord server. I'm setting them up for Mount & Blade and different games, but at the moment we've got up our Minecraft FTB Revelation server, so if you're a massive goddamn nerd with no life, come on the Discord, find out the info, and I'll see you there. Lord of the Rings, perhaps one of the biggest and most beloved franchises of all time. Well, except Star Wars. But to be fair, if it carries on the way that it's going, I doubt it's going to be for much longer. Arguably the start of the fantasy revival, Tolkien created something incredible. Taking up the mantle, of course, Peter Jackson took up with the baton to create 3 of the most cult-defying films of all time, and they made 3 fairly average cash-ins. But because of this, Lord of the Rings is perhaps one of the most sought-after licenses. Since the dawn of time, Total War fans have been asking for a Lord of the Rings Total War. With similar eras such as medieval and Rome, it seemed like the perfect solution, the perfect fit. And small tasters of the possibilities such as the Third Age Total War mods and the Rise of Mordor mods moistened up players' phalange. No, that sounds wrong, not phalange. But nothing quite filled that gap. So will it ever happen? Will CA ever release Lord of the Rings Total War? Unfortunately, I very much doubt it. I love Total War, and of course I love Lord of the Rings more than pretty much anything, and I think they're the perfect combination. But going through, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the things that could happen and why it could be, but really, the negatives and the cons really overweigh most of this. By the way, so if you can hear a fan in the background, it's an extremely hot day in England, and I currently feel like I am being roasted, and this time not by my YouTube comments. First off, Lord of the Rings has one set story. I mean, if it was being based off the films, which is the most common part of Lord of the Rings that most people know about, yes, there's a lot of lore and backstory, but let's be honest, the wider audience don't really know about. I know there's going to be some nerds in the comments saying, but there's so much lore, I know everything about it. No. That's great. And yeah, it's great. The amount of lore behind Lord of the Rings is vast and incredible, but the majority of people aren't really clued in on that. So that wouldn't be their biggest selling point. So if they were going to get the biggest selling point, they'd have to sell it on the films and the Lord of the Rings books themselves. But being based on the film, would it really work if it was solely based on something that had one set story? Since the Total War games are based in an era, yes, Lord of the Rings is an era, but the reason that made Lord of the Rings great is the story behind it, what was going on through that era. If it was just based solely on the time through the films, surely they'd have to base some of that story in there as well. But would that work with a Total War game, having a story in it? But let's talk about the other side, where of course it's based around the lore of Lord of the Rings, the bigger world, Middle-earth in general. This would mean they'd have to get the license for the background, which, in all honesty, to get the license for the films is expensive, but to get the license for whole of Middle-earth is another level, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. But yes, this would make more, granted, a fleshed out game if it was going to be made into a Total War game, but the Lord of the Rings license is not easy to obtain. It is famously expensive. I mean, who's had it in the past? What? EA, Lego, LucasArts, wait, what? Getting your hands on the license to this to actually make something worth it with this license is famously expensive. I mean, Amazon paid $250 million for the rights to make a TV show. And yes, while this is a much bigger project than a game like Total War Lord of the Rings, it's not going to be cheap. Which I'm sure the Games Workshop deal was pretty expensive to get. I mean, Games Workshop is the biggest miniatures company ever. Warhammer is a franchise that has spanned multiple games, films, magazines, and of course, the miniatures themselves. So yes, the Warhammer license, you could say, is maybe just expensive for Lord of the Rings. Well, no, it's not. But also, at the same time, there's more of a symbiotic relationship between these two companies, between Games Workshop and CA. You see, Total War is the biggest strategy franchise. Games Workshop is the biggest miniatures franchise. So if they made a game together, as they did, at least 2 games with a third on its way, Warhammer gets a massive sales boost as soon as Total War Warhammer came out, and it did. That showed. Even I got back into Warhammer, and I'm someone that doesn't have the time for that, and I can't imagine the countless other people that did the same. But how would that work with Lord of the Rings? CA, yes, of course, they get their half, they get to make the Lord of the Rings Total War, but what would Lord of the Rings get? How would that relationship work? More sales on Frodo miniatures? Of course, I have my opinions on Lord of the Rings and Total War and how it would work. I think it's basically a given that Total War and Lord of the Rings would probably work pretty well. And of course, it would sell massively. But getting hold of that license is the issue. But that's probably the main issue that's going to have a theme throughout this video. But that's not the only thing, as this comment by Jackal goes into on the Steam forums. Many people already discussed this. One of the biggest things is filling out unit rushes for more than 4 races. Even though flushing it out would make more sense since Total War Warhammer already covers all of those same races vastly better than a Lord of the Rings one would. Also, the Lord of the Rings tabletop didn't really do well for a similar reason. Yes, we do get in Total War Warhammer orcs, we get elves, we get magic, everything that comes with that. There are additional races in each Lord of the Rings and Warhammer retrospectively. And yes, they can be vastly different, but these races are based around the same thing. So filling out a whole roster in the Lord of the Rings world, especially if it was based around the films, which it would have to be in order to get a massive selling point, is that going to really fill out a really unique and diverse roster that the other Total War games have? I'm not 100% sure if it would. But of course, as the post continues to say, they could plan on doing one game with just 4 races and a few minor ones with crap units. But that wouldn't really work, unless you spanned out into Greater Middle Earth, which not many people are too familiar with. Then it goes on to more of the licenses would be very expensive with them, and even other RTS based games on the Lord of the Rings unit rosters were very limited. Some didn't even make sense, and others literally combined different factions under one banner. So this is another great point about how it cannot work in terms of gameplay. Having a limited roster, the Total War games need to be diverse and filled out. That's what makes them successful. Yes, they have this great gameplay, but it'd be nothing without diverse factions. And have they stumbled in the past? Yes. I'm looking at you, Bretonia, and I know you guys like Bretonia, but Bretonia is... oh, come on, they are bad. Come on. But it goes back to that, it would sell amazingly, but I just don't see it happening. But let's look at the other side. I mean, Warhammer shows that fantasy spells and magic do work, but Warhammer then was written as a game. It has its own rules. It has set ways of making things work to put it into a game. People have things that they can do, but they have limitations. It's not like Lord of the Rings, which does not have these rules. There are no limitations in terms of the universe. Of course, there's what Tolkien wrote, but there's no set game rules, and you sort of need game rules. The way this works with Warhammer is a guy with spells can do these spells, but it has a mana cost. Yes, this could be implemented with Lord of the Rings things, but there's no set thing that's already there. These would have to be many different specifications that CA would have to come up with themselves and basically be pulling them out of thin air, because Lord of the Rings was never meant to be a game. Warhammer was. And I know I've been comparing these games a lot, but you can see the similarities and see why, yes, Warhammer one way makes it possible that these things could work, but the other way completely pushes them to the side. But you might be saying, Resonant, the historical Total Wars never were meant to be games, if you know what I mean. History was never meant to be a game. How would that work? But the historical Total Wars do have their limitations, because they are real life. These are not fantasy. It's limited by how real life works. You don't have dragons, you don't have spells. The only reason they work in Warhammer is because it's made to be a game with limitations on it. And I think it's a case of perhaps too little limitations to make a well-focused game. But let's backtrack a little bit to those licenses. Well, we've gone through how the licenses are very expensive to obtain, but then I saw a comment on one of the forums that was actually not a bad shout. Now this, of course, is the fact that CA now have a deal with Games Workshop. They have this deal in order to create Total War Warhammer. But remember, Games Workshop don't just make Warhammer, they also make Lord of the Rings minifigures. So Games Workshop have a license to do that. And I saw that comment and straight away I was like, that's not a bad idea. They could sort of piggyback off the back of Games Workshop's license to do that. But then you've got to remember, Games Workshop is able to give its license away because it owns that license. It's able to choose what price it gives it away to CA in order to make a game off it, or in this case, 3 games. Lord of the Rings gave that license to Games Workshop in order to make a set amount of miniatures. It told them what they could do, what they couldn't do with these miniatures, and it basically gave them how they can make a game out of it, which is great. So it seems like CA could just say to Games Workshop, could we borrow that license as well? But that's unfortunately not how it works with 3 companies here, not just 2. Games Workshop doesn't own the Lord of the Rings license, so if CA wanted that Games Workshop license, it'd still have to go to Lord of the Rings themselves and say, hey, we want to make a game out of this. Games Workshop doesn't really have a say who they can give that license away to. So unfortunately, I think that was a great idea, but that doesn't really work. But really, after 2 Total War Warhammer games and a third on its way, is it really a good idea for Total War to go too far into fantasy? I mean, isn't historical games what set their course and their name? Isn't that what they're known for, what people have been always asking for? Well, I feel like Lord of the Rings is an exception to that. While many people are very opposed to Total War Warhammer at this point, having too many of them, they want the historical games back, I think there would be a lot of leniency if they kept in fantasy just to go towards Lord of the Rings, just because of the pedigree the license have and how beloved the franchise is. Finally, I want to leave it on a light note. While I very much doubt this will ever happen because of licenses, filling out unit rosters, how it will work, the lore, gameplay mechanics, if they were going to do it, this would seem the right time to do it. I mean, think about it. What's coming up at the moment? The Lord of the Rings Amazon show, which is set to be budgeted for 5 seasons and have $1 billion towards it, which has caused a massive stir in the nerd culture. You know, the cringiest phrase you can possibly think of, Jacob. Well done. But it's the perfect time. Imagine the Amazon Lord of the Rings Season 1 coming out, and releasing it conjunctively is Lord of the Rings Total War. It would work perfectly, and it would sell even better than it would already do. As a conclusion, Lord of the Rings Total War would be incredible. Mods like Third Age and Rise of Mordor shown that it works well in the era and the style. But does it work with a campaign map? Third Age sort of did that okay with Medieval 2, but even then it did have its limitations and issues. Rise of Mordor at the moment is solely just the factions that you can play with, so that doesn't really show all too much, but it does look goddamn awesome. Lord of the Rings Total War would be incredible. I don't think there's a person out there that doesn't want that to happen. But will it happen? Unfortunately, at this point, I don't see it happening anytime soon. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I think it's a given that people like Total War and Lord of the Rings together and think that would be an amazing mix. If you don't, leave a comment down below. I can't promise other people in the comments won't give you a shit for it, but if you want to start an argument, please don't do that. My comments are as bad already. Do you think there's enough content for them to put in the game, and do you think there's a way they can get that incredibly infamous license? Make sure you leave a comment down below, and I'd love to read them. Make sure you give a thumbs up if you haven't already, and join my Discord for all the game servers. I'm bringing Mount and Blade, Minecraft already, and we'll see what else we can get going. And support my Patreon if you want to help pay for those servers, because it's coming out my own pocket, and it's really hurting. But thank you for watching, and until then, I will see you in the next one.